Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Picture video with me, Sargon Nissan. I'm from the Bretton Woods Project, which is a London-based NGO working with civil society around the world. We are a watchdog and information provider, and if you like, media and public commentator on the work of the World Bank and the IMF. So today I'll be talking about the excitement that surrounds new institutions that are being described as rivals to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, which are often referred to, though there's two institutions, as the BRICS Bank. Specifically, what I'm referring to is the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is a sort of alternative to the IMF, and the New Development Bank. These institutions have been created by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The so-called BRICS nations, who are now part of the G20, and these institutions, much like their increased influence, are being used as a marker to signify that there is a significant change in how the international financial architecture works and how global economic and political relations are governed. I'm going to argue that that's not really the case. And the reason I'm going to make that argument is because I don't see that the implications of these institutions are what a lot of people have claimed, nor that the prognosis for the, if you like, Washington consensus institutions of the bank and the fund is as bad as people say. Though I don't think the story is so simple that it's the same, but I'll get into that. So let me explain a little bit what these institutions are. The Contingent Reserve Arrangement, or the alternative to the IMF, is a sort of solidarity fund, where they're putting in each of the countries from the BRICS, that's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, some money, $10 billion, and eventually we'll have up to $100 billion available. And why are they doing it? Simply to have a contingency in case of financial crisis. That's the role that normally the IMF plays, as we've seen recently in Europe and in many developing countries for decades. When they have a crisis, if it's their currency or balance of trade, money is provided, but conditions are attached. The BRICS nations say that they're going to short-circuit this and they'll have no need of the IMF in the future. Similarly, they've developed something called the New Development Bank, which is what most people have probably heard of as the BRICS Bank. The BRICS Bank is similarly has a certain amount of money that's been promised, is likely to start sometime in 2016. The intention is that it will be financing investments on behalf of the 5 BRICS nations through headquarters in Shanghai and a major office in Africa, Johannesburg specifically, and investing in infrastructure. Their argument is that there is a major gap in public investment, in particular in developing countries, and their own example of fast growth should be taken as a vindication of having an alternative to something like the World Bank with all the problems people associate with the Washington Consensus and its approach to development. So, are we seeing a new development model emerge? That's what people have been saying. Are we seeing the end of the Washington institutions, specifically the Washington Consensus proponents of the World Bank and IMF, who themselves perhaps argue that that's not a fair characterization? I think there's actually probably two stories. We have to start with the geopolitics. We moved from a world of the G8 to the G20, and that includes countries like the BRICS. But are we really seeing a different approach to development and economic growth? Or are we seeing a new competitor? Is it the game the same but with some new players? I would argue that it is. What are the implications, though, for the fund and the bank? Well, I think for the fund, the little heard of Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is itself very little money when you're talking about economies the size of China and indeed India, seems to me to be more of a playing card, or if you like, a negotiating tactic. Because underpinning this changing geopolitical environment are many negotiations about how the existing institutions of the global financial architecture need to be reformed to represent better developing countries. But when we say developing countries, we principally mean China. And as such, this is very explicitly, even in the words of the Brazilian finance minister in 2007, no less, if we do not get better representation, he argued, we will seek self-insurance. We will fragment the multilateral financial system because we will seek to participate in regional reserve sharing pools and regional monetary institutions. Those big phrases represent exactly the two BRICS institutions we described. But the IMF is still critical to the functioning of this alternative fund. In fact, it relies upon the involvement of the IMF. And when you look at the new development bank, you see an institution which does not have any mechanism by which it could change the way it works. It's going to be financed by capital markets, and we in civil society have been told in no uncertain terms, this will be a competitor. So we have, if you like, a sort of Goldman Sachs that happens to be owned by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it's even less of a state-led institution when you look at the structure of its management and executive. So we do live in changing times, but what we see with the institutions that are new and old is adaptation. For the World Bank, it's trying to recover its relevance by focusing on private investment and on focusing on the problems that we face in an environment where politicians and governments have very little public money to spend. Whereas we see the IMF actually growing from strength to strength and doing more deals and having more money than it's ever had. This is something I'll probably go into in the other video I'm doing for the bigger picture on the IMF and conditionality. But what we see in the result of the work of the BRICS is rather more continuities and new players fighting the same old game, demanding greater resources and seeking to access and control land, major infrastructure, and major public investment. What we do not see is any challenge to the traditional model of development that has been associated with the IMF and the World Bank. So more changiness than change.